There exists a place, not a location you will find on any map, nor one bounded by geography or convention, where the fabric between what is seen and what is unseen grows gossamer thin. It is the space where autumn dies into winter, where daylight surrenders to endless night, where the living world touches the realm of spirits with fingertips so delicate that few ever notice the contact. This is the threshold, and it has always belonged to those who walk between, the restless, the cursed, the eternally damned. On certain nights when the veil grows even thinner, when the barrier becomes as fragile as a spider's thread stretched across an abyss, we catch glimpses of those who dwell in that in-between place. We see their lights dancing across darkened fields. We hear the echo of their presence in our own celebrations, our traditions, our deepest folklore. And it all began with one man, a man of cunning and deception, whose name has been spoken for centuries around Irish hearths, whose story has been twisted and transformed across generations and continents, yet whose curse remains eternally unchanged. Before you continue further into this journey, I must invite you to join us here at Echoes of the Old World, where we explore the forgotten stories that shaped our cultures and the supernatural beings that haunted our ancestors' dreams. Subscribe to our channel and become part of a community that seeks to understand the deeper meaning behind the myths we thought we knew. Your presence here matters, and your voice, your perspective on these ancient tales, is invaluable to us. Whether you are watching from Ireland itself, from distant shores, or from somewhere in between, I want to know, where are you joining us from tonight? Share your location in the comments below, and tell me what draws you to these stories of folklore and ancient curses. Are you a seeker of history, a lover of the supernatural, someone searching for meaning in the old ways? Let me know in the comments what you think so far and what you hope to discover as we explore the legend of Jack-o'-lantern together. Now, let us step across that threshold and into the story itself. A tale so deeply woven into our modern celebrations that we have almost forgotten its origins. When children don jackets and masks on the last night of October, when families carve glowing faces into pumpkins and place them on porches as sentinels against the dark, when communities gather to celebrate what we now call Halloween, few understand that they are participating in a ritual born from damnation itself. They are, unknowingly, keeping vigil for a soul who has wandered between worlds for centuries. This is not a story meant to frighten you into sleepless nights, though fear will certainly touch you as we uncover these truths. Rather, it is a story meant to illuminate, quite literally, the profound connection between our modern traditions and the ancient beliefs that shaped them. It is a story about how one man's curse became humanity's most iconic holiday symbol. The legend begins in Ireland, in that mist-shrouded land where the boundary between the natural and supernatural has always been permeable, where the ancient Celts walked in constant awareness of the spirits that shared their world. Ireland is a place where stone circles mark power, where certain hills are known to be homes of the Seidhe, where entire families might vanish for what they believe is a single night, only to return decades later, aged not at all. This is the landscape into which Jack, known to history simply as Stingy Jack, was born. Not a king or a nobleman, not someone recorded in official chronicles or celebrated in sanctioned histories, but rather a man whose name survived through oral tradition, through whispered warnings, through the collective memory of a people who understood that sometimes the most important stories are those that persist precisely because they do not appear in books. Jack was a man of the Irish countryside, cunning and sharp-witted, the kind of figure that appears in folklore across many cultures. The trickster, the clever one, the person who believes himself so intelligent that he might deceive even those who exist beyond mortality itself. What makes Jack's story unique, what has ensured its survival across centuries and continents, is not merely that he was clever, Many clever men have come and gone, their names lost to time. Rather, Jack's significance lies in what his fate reveals about the cosmic rules that govern interaction between the human world and the supernatural realms. His story is, in essence, a cautionary tale about hubris, about the consequences of believing that wit alone can protect you from forces far greater and older than yourself. Yet it is also, paradoxically, a tale about defiance, about a man who repeatedly challenged beings of immense power and survived the confrontation. Jack did not accept his place in the natural order. He did not bow before the supernatural with the appropriate humility that ancient wisdom would suggest. And for this transgression, for this remarkable and terrible pride, he was punished in a way that transcends ordinary death. As we prepare to delve deeper into Jack's life, to understand who he was before his damnation, to witness the moments when his cunning proved both his salvation and his eternal condemnation, remember that you are not merely learning a story. You are learning why your ancestors carved faces into gourds, why your communities light fires to guide the spirits of the dead, why this particular night in late October holds such profound significance across the world. The roots of Halloween run deeper than costume parties and candy distributions. They stretch back through centuries, through immigration and cultural transformation, through the meeting of old world traditions and new world landscapes. They reach into the very heart of how humanity understands the boundary between life and death, between the seen and the unseen, between our world and the realms that exist in eternal twilight. To understand the curse that would consume Jack-o'-lantern, one must first understand the man who walked beneath Irish skies long before his name became synonymous with damnation. Jack was not born into nobility or wealth, nor was he destined for sanctity or remembered virtue. He was, by all accounts, an ordinary man in circumstance, but extraordinary in temperament. A person whose wit and cunning marked him as fundamentally different from those who shared his station. The rural Irish countryside of his era was a place of limited opportunities, of harsh winters and uncertain harvests, where survival often depended more on cleverness than on honest labor. Jack possessed that rarest of commodities in such a world, an intellect sharp and nurtured snow. Circumvent the rules that bound ordinary men, and the moral flexibility to deploy that intellect without hesitation or remorse. Imagine, if you will, a man standing at the crossroads of a small Irish village as twilight descends. His appearance would not mark him as remarkable, neither particularly tall nor short, neither handsome nor grotesque. Yet there was something in his bearing that suggested calculation, that hinted at schemes perpetually in motion behind his eyes. Jack was the kind of person about whom stories accrued naturally, stories whispered in taverns and around hearthfires, tales that grew more elaborate with each retelling, yet carried within them kernels of uncomfortable truth. He was known throughout his community as Stingy Jack, precisely because of his relationship with wealth and obligation. Despite opportunities and resources that would have allowed him to live generously, Jack hoarded his gains with an intensity that bordered on obsession. This was not the parsimony of a poor man rationing scarce resources. This was the deliberate withholding of one who possessed sufficient means but refused to share them. A man who derived satisfaction not from accumulation alone, but from the knowledge that others went without because he denied them. The nickname itself, Stingy Jack, was a form of social condemnation, a marker of moral failure in a culture that placed great value on hospitality and communal sharing. In Irish tradition, refusing sustenance to a traveller or denying aid to a neighbour in need was not merely impolite, it was a violation of sacred custom, a transgression against the unwritten laws that held communities together. Yet Jack seemed immune to such social pressure, or perhaps, more accurately, he found perverse pleasure in defying it. His stinginess was not a character flaw he sought to overcome, but rather a defining characteristic he cultivated deliberately, as if he had decided in some crucial moment that the approval of his community was worthless compared to the power derived from withholding what others desired. This attitude would later prove revealing about his fundamental nature, his unwillingness to acknowledge authority, his refusal to bow to convention, his determination to exist according to his own logic rather than society's dictates. Beyond his reputation for miserliness, Jack was known as a prodigious drinker and a man prone to deception in matters both trivial and significant. He frequented the public houses of his region, where he cultivated a reputation as someone who could outsmart any potential competitor in matters of commerce, cards, or verbal sparring. His wit was sharp and cutting, the kind that drew laughter from onlookers, but left its targets feeling diminished, manipulated, and somehow responsible for their own humiliation. Jack possessed the rare ability to make people doubt their own judgment, to convince them that they had willingly accepted unfair bargains, that they themselves were foolish for falling prey to his schemes. In an era when most conflict was resolved through physical strength or social standing, Jack had discovered that intellectual dominion was far more satisfying, far more complete in its subjugation of others. There was something almost artistic in his approach to deception, a craftsman's pride in executing the perfect con, in orchestrating situations where his targets felt they had made their own choices freely, when in fact they had been herded toward predetermined conclusions like sheep following an invisible fence. What emerged in Jack's character was a profound disdain for the natural order of things, a rejection of the hierarchy that placed certain beings above others and demanded appropriate deference and respect. Perhaps this stemmed from his humble origins, from a childhood or young adulthood in which he witnessed others exercise power arbitrarily and without accountability. Perhaps it was simply the manifestation of a temperament inclined toward rebellion, a mind constitutionally unable to accept limitation or subordination. Whatever its source, this defiance would become the defining feature of his existence, the quality that would eventually bring him into direct confrontation with forces far more ancient and powerful than any human authority. In the rural Ireland of his time, the supernatural realm was not an abstraction or a matter of religious doctrine debated in ecclesiastical circles. It was a living, immediate reality, as present and undeniable as the weather or the soil. The fairy folk haunted the landscape. The spirits of the dead lingered in places of their attachment, and the devil himself was understood as an actual being, not a symbolic representation of evil, but a concrete entity with agency and will. Into this world of supernatural reality stepped Stingy Jack, a man whose very nature seemed designed to challenge boundaries and question hierarchies. He was precisely the kind of human that the forces of the unseen realm might notice. Precisely the sort of being whose combination of cunning and defiance might provoke supernatural interest. Jack had spent his mortal years convinced that his wit was sufficient to navigate any challenge, that his ability to think quickly and deceive cleverly would serve him in any situation. He had proven this theory repeatedly within the human world, accumulating small victories, minor triumphs, moments where his schemes had succeeded and his rivals had been left confounded. But the supernatural realm operated according to different rules, rules that predated human civilization and could not be circumvented through simple cleverness alone. Jack did not yet know this fundamental truth. He was a man in the prime of his abilities, convinced of his own invulnerability, utterly unprepared for the moment when his cunning would be tested against something far older and far more powerful than any adversary he had yet faced. The devil, as many ancient traditions suggest, does not often walk upon the earth in search of ordinary mortals. He has servants, minions, and legions of lesser demons who attend to the corruption of human souls, who whisper temptation into the ears of the ambitious and the desperate. Yet there are moments when the devil himself takes interest in a particular soul, when he recognizes in a human being a kindred spirit, someone whose commitment to wickedness, whose refusal to acknowledge moral constraint, seems worthy of direct attention. Jack had cultivated precisely such a reputation through his years of deception and miserliness, through his systematic disregard for the welfare of others, and his utter confidence in his own supremacy. The universe, it seems, has a way of responding to such arrogance, and on a fateful night, when Jack found himself alone on a road shrouded in mist and darkness, he discovered that his years of defiance had attracted an audience far more significant than any he had anticipated. The encounter began, as many such meetings do in folklore, with apparent coincidence. Jack was traveling along a path he had traversed countless times before, returning home after a night of drinking and gambling from which he had emerged victorious, as he always did. The night was the sort that Ireland produces in abundance, cold and damp, with a mist so thick that the world beyond arm's length became indistinct and uncertain. It was the kind of darkness that invited reflection, that made a man aware of his own solitude in the vast and uncaring universe. Jack, however, was not a man inclined toward philosophical contemplation. His mind was occupied with calculations of profit, with schemes yet to be executed, with the satisfying certainty that he possessed the wit to navigate any situation that might present itself. It was in this state of supreme confidence that he encountered the figure on the road, a man of indeterminate age and bearing, dressed in clothing that seemed somehow inappropriate to the Irish landscape, as if the figure belonged to a different time or place entirely. The meeting began with courtesies, with the social pleasantries that masked far deeper purposes. The stranger, who would later be understood to be the devil himself, though he never made this explicit announcement, engaged Jack in conversation, praising his reputation for cleverness and cunning, flattering his ego with observations about his remarkable ability to outmaneuver those around him. This was precisely the sort of attention that Jack craved, the recognition of his superiority by someone who seemed to possess knowledge and perception beyond the ordinary. The stranger suggested that they continue their conversation in a nearby pub, offering to purchase drinks for Jack as a gesture of respect and admiration for his legendary wit. Jack, suspecting nothing amiss, or perhaps suspecting much, but confident in his ability to manage whatever might transpire, agreed readily. The two walked together through the mist, and Jack found himself, strangely, compelled by his mysterious companion, drawn by a magnetism that he could not quite explain but did not wish to resist. As the evening progressed within the warmth of the tavern, the stranger began to propose increasingly audacious wagers, challenges that seemed designed to test Jack's cleverness against tasks both peculiar and ominous. These were not ordinary bets of the sort that Jack had made countless times with local merchants and competitors. Rather, they carried an undercurrent of something far more significant, as if the stakes extended beyond mere money or social status into realms that Jack could sense, but not quite articulate. The stranger proposed that Jack perform a feat of transformation, an impossible task that would surely prove Jack's limits. Yet with each proposal, Jack found within himself a determination to succeed, a refusal to acknowledge defeat that seemed to override rational caution. The stranger, observing this pattern, finally presented his ultimate challenge. He wagered that Jack could not entrap him, could not catch him, could not impose any constraint upon his freedom. The devil, for this was indeed the devil, testing the mettle of a soul he had marked as potentially his own, seemed confident that no mortal possessed the cunning to succeed in such an endeavour. What transpired next revealed the profound difference between ordinary human cleverness and the kind of wit that borders on supernatural itself. Jack, rather than attempting to physically restrain his opponent or to employ obvious means of entrapment, instead suggested that they test the wager immediately. He proposed that they climb the ancient oak tree that stood outside the tavern, a massive tree with branches that seemed to reach toward heaven itself, its wood gnarled and ancient, its roots sunk deep into Irish soil that predated recorded history. The stranger agreed, perhaps underestimating Jack's intentions, or perhaps curious to see how this mortal might attempt to accomplish his boast. They ascended into the branches together, climbing into the height and isolation of the tree's crown, leaving behind the warmth and safety of the world below. It was in this elevated and isolated space that Jack executed his scheme, with a precision and audacity that suggested he had anticipated this moment, that some part of him had been prepared for a confrontation with forces beyond the ordinary. Jack produced a knife and, with careful deliberation, began to carve crosses into the bark of the tree, deep, deliberate cuts that form the sacred symbol that Christianity associates with holiness and protection. The devil, suddenly comprehending his predicament, understood that he had been outmaneuvered through a simple yet devastating stratagem. The crosses, being the symbol of divine power, created a barrier that he could not cross, a boundary that his nature could not transgress. He was trapped in the tree's highest branches, unable to descend without encountering the carved symbols that Jack had placed at strategic intervals along the trunk and major branches. For the first time in countless centuries, the devil found himself constrained, limited, subjected to the will of a human being. The realization of his imprisonment seemed to provoke a transformation in his demeanor, from the confident and urbane stranger into something far more primal and furious. A being whose ancient pride had been fundamentally wounded by this unexpected reversal of fortune. The devil, being a creature of ancient memory and infinite patience, does not forget humiliation as humans understand forgetting. He does not dissipate his rage in outbursts and then move forward into new concerns. Rather, he harbors grievance with the constancy of deep geological forces, a pressure that accumulates over time, waiting for the moment when it will inevitably express itself in catastrophic release. Jack, having successfully negotiated his release from the oak tree through cunning negotiation, the devil agreeing to renounce his claim on Jack's soul in exchange for freedom from the crosses, believed that he had purchased his safety through this single transgressive act. He returned to his life in rural Ireland with renewed confidence, if such a thing were possible, convinced that he had bested not merely a man, but an actual force of malevolence, that his wit had proven sufficient to overcome even the most formidable adversary imaginable. Years passed, and Jack continued his existence much as before, drinking, deceiving, hoarding his wealth, accumulating stories of his cleverness and audacity. The supernatural encounter faded into the realm of memory, becoming almost dreamlike in its particularity, as if perhaps it had been nothing more than an elaborate hallucination brought on by drink and darkness. Yet the devil's nature is such that he does not allow transgressions against his authority to pass without reckoning. In the vast cosmic scales of existence, a few years or even a few decades are insignificant, mere moments in the eternity of his being. The devil was content to wait, to observe Jack from the spaces between perception, to watch as the mortal man continued his defiant existence, accumulating sins and transgressions with each passing year. And then, on another night, when darkness covered the Irish landscape and the veil between worlds grew thin, the devil arranged another encounter. This time, however, he would not approach with the urbane courtesy of a stranger seeking companionship. This time, the devil came directly, making clear his nature and his intentions, giving Jack no opportunity for misunderstanding about who or what he was confronting. The devil appeared before Jack with a clarity and visibility that left no room for doubt, manifesting himself in the fullness of his infernal majesty, a presence so overwhelming and terrible that Jack felt his courage threaten to fragment entirely in that moment of confrontation. The devil announced his purpose with stark directness. He had come to collect what he believed was rightfully his, Jack's soul. The wager of the oak tree, he proclaimed, was void, a trick and a deception that he had allowed only because he possessed the patience to wait for the proper moment of reckoning. Jack had thought himself clever in trapping the devil through the symbolism of the cross, but the devil was far older than Christianity itself, far older than the symbolic meanings that humans assigned to objects and marks. He had permitted his entrapment only because his pride had been intrigued by the audacity of this mortal creature, because he had wanted to observe how a human would respond when given such power over his destiny. Now, that moment of indulgence had passed. The time for collecting payment had arrived, and Jack would find that his cleverness, while noteworthy, was insufficient to save him from the consequences of his actions. Jack stood before this terrible being with the knowledge that his end had come, that this time there would be no escape through simple wit or cunning deception. It was in this desperate moment that Jack revealed once again the quality that had defined his existence: an absolute refusal to accept defeat, a willingness to gamble everything on a final, desperate stratagem. Rather than bowing to his fate or attempting to negotiate through conventional means, Jack proposed one final wager to the devil. He asked that the devil prove his power by accomplishing a seemingly impossible task. Jack requested that the devil climb a nearby apple tree and bring down an apple to Jack, so that they might share one final meal together before Jack surrendered his soul. It was a request so strange, so unnecessary and arbitrary, that it carried the weight of a ritual proposal, as if Jack was attempting to create one more moment where the rules might shift, and his cunning might yet prove efficacious. The devil, his pride perhaps still engaged by this mortal's defiant refusal to surrender, agreed to the task. He ascended into the apple tree, and Jack, rather than repeating his trick with crosses, employed a different stratagem altogether. Jack produced a chain, old, heavy, and wrought from iron, and quickly wrapped it around the tree's trunk, securing the devil within its branches just as effectively as he had with the carved crosses. Iron, being a substance antithetical to supernatural beings and creatures of the other world, held the devil as surely as any sacred symbol could. The devil found himself imprisoned once again, captured through Jack's wit and audacity, constrained by a limitation as complete as before. This second entrapment revealed something crucial about the nature of these encounters. Jack possessed not merely intelligence, but a kind of supernatural cunning that seemed to operate according to rules that transcended ordinary human limitation. He appeared to understand, at some level beneath conscious thought, the mechanisms by which supernatural beings could be constrained, the symbols and substances that held power over such creatures. Whether this understanding came from intuition, from some hidden knowledge, or from something more profound, Jack could not have articulated. Yet it manifested repeatedly in his ability to recognize and exploit the very weaknesses that might trap his adversary. Once again, the devil found himself negotiating with Jack from a position of constraint rather than power. offering terms and conditions in exchange for his freedom. This time, the devil swore not merely to renounce his claim upon Jack's soul, but to grant Jack additional years of life. Additional time to exist in the human world before his inevitable reckoning would come due. The devil's fury was palpable, a force that seemed to cause the very air to tremble with malevolence. Yet he remained bound by the iron chain, and thus constrained to accept Jack's terms. What Jack did not fully comprehend was that each time he repeated this pattern of entrapment and negotiation, he was not truly escaping his fate, but merely postponing it, setting the stage for a final reckoning that would be all the more terrible because it was so thoroughly anticipated and so completely inevitable. The years that followed Jack's second encounter with the devil were years of apparent normalcy, yet they carried within them the weight of an inevitability that Jack seemed to sense but could not articulate. He continued his existence much as before, drinking, scheming, accumulating wealth while refusing to share it. Yet there had entered into his character a quality that had not been present in his younger years. A certain frenetic urgency, as if he understood at some deep and unacknowledged level that his time was drawing toward its conclusion. The gift of additional years that the devil had granted seemed less a blessing than a curse, an extension that only prolonged his awareness of the doom that awaited him. Jack moved through the Irish countryside with the gait of a man perpetually expecting the appearance of his supernatural creditor, yet simultaneously living as if he could somehow circumvent or evade the obligations that he had accrued through his repeated triumphs over infernal adversaries. Those who knew him in his advancing years reported that he had become increasingly isolated, increasingly prone to suspicion and paranoia, as if he had begun to understand that his cunning, while formidable, could not indefinitely shield him from consequences that operated according to rules far more ancient than human morality. Jack's death, when it finally arrived, came not as a dramatic confrontation with supernatural forces, but as a quiet and mundane event, the kind of ending that visited countless mortals without fanfare or significant notice. He was aging by then, his body worn by decades of excess and debauchery, his health declining with the inexorability of human physiology. He fell ill on a winter night. The precise nature of his illness varies across different tellings of the legend, and within a matter of days, he found himself approaching the threshold between life and death that all mortals must eventually cross. Jack lay upon his deathbed in whatever modest dwelling he inhabited, aware that the moment he had been dreading for years had finally arrived. He was dying, and death meant confrontation with the afterlife, meant facing judgment for the accumulation of sins that had defined his existence. His cunning, which had served him so well throughout his mortal years, suddenly seemed a fragile and inadequate tool for navigating what lay beyond the veil of death. As Jack's mortal life came to its conclusion, he would have experienced the strange and terrible clarity that sometimes visits the dying, a moment of understanding in which the illusions and self-deceptions that sustained him during his earthly existence suddenly dissolved. He would have recognized that his cleverness, while undeniably real and undeniably effective within the human world, had been operating according to fundamentally different rules than those that governed the supernatural realm. His victories over the devil had not been victories in any ultimate or cosmic sense. They had been temporary reprieves, moments of advantage in a game far longer and more consequential than any single human lifetime. The devil had allowed these triumphs precisely because they did not matter, because they were part of a larger design that stretched far beyond Jack's comprehension or control. Now, at the moment of death, Jack found himself stripped of the elaborate scaffolding of self-deception that he had constructed across his lifetime, facing the reality of his existence and the genuine weight of his accumulated transgressions. The ancient texts and religious traditions speak of death as a journey, a transition from one state of being to another, and Jack's death followed this pattern, though not according to any script that conventional religion might have prepared him to expect. As his mortal body lay in its final moments of cessation, Jack's spirit, or essence, that which persists beyond the dissolution of flesh, began its journey toward what he had expected would be either heaven or hell, judgment followed by eternal placement according to his merit or demerit. Yet the universe, in its profound complexity and its occasional cruel irony, had arranged something far more complicated for this particular soul. Jack had lived a life defined by avarice, drunkenness, deception, and a profound lack of charity toward his fellow humans. These were transgressions that placed him squarely in the category of souls destined for infernal punishment. Yet, he had also repeatedly and deliberately humiliated the devil himself, had constrained and limited and negotiated with the Prince of Darkness as if they were merely mortal equals, engaged in some cosmic business transaction. This placed him in a category entirely outside the ordinary framework of divine judgment and punishment. The journey of Jack's soul, therefore, did not proceed directly to the underworld as he might have expected. Instead, he found himself caught in a peculiar liminal space, neither fully admitted to paradise nor cast down into the depths of perdition. Heaven's gates, when his spirit approached them, remained closed, not through accident or misunderstanding, but through deliberate denial. The guardians and architects of paradise looked upon this soul and recognized in him nothing that merited entrance to their celestial realm. A lifetime of selfishness and cruelty, of deliberate harm inflicted upon others through manipulation and deception, could not be washed away simply because he had outwitted the devil through clever stratagems. Jack's sins were his own, utterly authentic expressions of his will and his character, and no supernatural evasion of damnation could render them any less genuine or any less damning in the eyes of divine judgment. Yet when Jack's spirit turned toward the infernal depths, toward the place of punishment that his transgressions had earned, he encountered a different impediment, one far more bitter and more terrible than simple rejection. The devil, still burning with the humiliation of being repeatedly trapped and constrained by a mortal human, refused entry to his realm. The Prince of Darkness had made a pact with Jack, however coerced and obtained through trickery that pact might have been, and he honored it, at least literally and technically. Jack had negotiated protection from hellfire and damnation, and the devil, while seething with rage at these repeated humiliations, upheld the letter of their agreements, even as he violated their spirit entirely. Hell's gates, therefore, remained closed to Jack just as completely as heaven's gates were closed. The soul of Stingy Jack found itself in a condition of absolute exile, accepted by neither realm, belonging nowhere in the cosmos, a consciousness condemned to perpetual wandering in the spaces between the worlds of the living and the dead. It was a punishment far more terrible than either heaven's judgment or hell's torment could have been, for it was a punishment of absolute isolation, of eternal exclusion from any form of rest or resolution or belonging. The rejection itself came not as a dramatic declaration, but rather as an absence, a profound and all-encompassing void where Jack had expected to encounter either acceptance or punishment. Picture, if you will, the moment of spiritual confrontation that awaits all souls at the threshold of death. The instant when a consciousness no longer bound by mortal flesh encounters the architecture of the cosmos itself, when it becomes clear to that awareness that the rules governing physical existence were merely shadows of far deeper and more fundamental laws. Jack's spirit, stripped of its earthly vessel and the protective illusions that flesh provides, found itself standing before the gates of paradise with all the bitter clarity that such a moment demands. The gates themselves were not locked in any conventional sense. Rather, they were simply closed, impenetrable, and utterly unwelcoming to a consciousness that bore within it the accumulated stains of selfishness and cruelty accumulated across a lifetime of exploitation and deception. The celestial beings, who might have ushered other souls toward redemption and eventual peace, regarded Jack with an expression, if such beings can be said to possess expressions, of sorrowful recognition. They saw within his essence the true nature of his existence, a soul fundamentally incompatible with the nature of paradise, a consciousness that had spent its mortal years actively rejecting the virtues and principles that heaven embodied. The basis for this rejection was not arbitrary or unjust, though to Jack in his desperation it must have seemed precisely that. Heaven's standards, after all, are not applied capriciously or according to whim. They reflect a profound metaphysical truth about the nature of spiritual reality, that a soul corrupted by avarice, marred by deliberate cruelty, and defined by its refusal to acknowledge the dignity and worth of other human beings, cannot simply cease to be those things through the act of death. Character, it seems, persists beyond the dissolution of the mortal body. The petty cruelties that Jack had perpetrated throughout his life, the elderly widow denied bread because he refused to share from his abundance, the children who went hungry while he hoarded resources, the countless individuals he had manipulated and humiliated for the satisfaction of his own ego. These formed part of the essential nature of who and what Jack was. To admit such a soul into paradise would not be a mercy, it would be an obscenity, a fundamental violation of the harmony and justice that characterized that realm. Heaven's gates remained closed not from cruelty, but from necessity, from the recognition that Jack's presence in paradise would be fundamentally incompatible with the nature of that place. Yet if heaven's rejection of Jack's soul was terrible, the subsequent rejection by the infernal realms proved in many ways far more devastating and far more consequential for his eternal fate. Jack turned his awareness toward the depths below, toward the underworld that he had expected would claim him, that according to his accumulated sins should have been his destination. Hell's architects and guardians, however, perceived a complication that heaven's guardians did not face. The devil, in his pride and in his rage at being humiliated by this mortal trickster, had made a pact, however extracted through deception and cunning, however contrary to the devil's intentions that pact might have been. The terms were explicit and unambiguous. Jack had negotiated his protection from hellish torment, had secured through successive stratagems a guarantee that the infernal realms would not claim him. The devil, despite his fury, despite his burning desire for revenge and the collection of the debt he felt Jack owed him, found himself bound by the letter of agreements that he himself had witnessed and affirmed. To violate those agreements would be to undermine the fundamental principles upon which his own dominion rested, the inviolability of pacts and bargains, the sacred nature of negotiated settlements between beings of power. This represented a cruelty of a different sort entirely, one that the devil could perpetrate upon Jack without violating the principles of his own nature. He would simply refuse entry. Where heaven had rejected Jack because his soul was incompatible with paradise, the devil refused Jack entry to hell, because to admit him would be to acknowledge the legitimacy of pacts negotiated through trickery and deception. The infernal legions parted before Jack's approaching spirit, their ranks withdrawing, their attention turning away as if he did not exist, as if his presence was beneath their notice, or perhaps contaminated in some way that made him unsuitable even for the depths of perdition. Hell's gates swung open, not in welcome but to provide passage, and Jack understood with devastating clarity that even that passage was not intended for him. He could pass through those gates, could move beyond them into the spaces below, but he would not be received, would not be claimed, would not find any resting place or established position within that infernal hierarchy. He would be permitted to wander the territories of the damned like a ghost among ghosts, a consciousness forever separate, forever excluded, forever denied even the bitter solidarity that the damned find with one another. Jack found himself, therefore, in a condition unprecedented and unforeseen, a soul rejected by both poles of the cosmic order, accepted by neither the realms of the blessed nor the realms of the damned. He was truly between, truly in between, condemned to occupy the threshold spaces that separate the world of the living from the world of the dead, the realm of paradise from the depths of perdition. This was a fate of such profound isolation, such absolute and complete exclusion, that it transcended any ordinary punishment. Torture, while terrible, at least provides a form of engagement, a relationship between punisher and punished. Exclusion is something far worse. It is a form of non-existence that nevertheless permits consciousness, an annihilation that does not grant the mercy of complete cessation. Jack's spirit found itself cast adrift in the liminal spaces, the thin places where the boundaries of reality grow permeable, those territories that exist at the threshold between world and underworld, between the seen and the unseen. Here, in this terrible emptiness, Jack would wander eternally, neither living nor dead, neither blessed nor damned, a consciousness utterly alone in the voids between all established orders and hierarchies. This was the true punishment for his transgression, not flames or torment administered by demonic servants, but rather the profound and endless isolation of absolute rejection, the curse of being forever unwelcome everywhere. In the vast expanse of the supernatural realm, in those spaces that exist neither fully in the world of the living, nor entirely in the domain of the dead, Jack wandered in a state of profound confusion and despair. He had escaped hell, technically and literally. Yet the escape had granted him nothing resembling freedom or relief. His consciousness persisted, aware and intact, yet utterly homeless, forever seeking a place of rest that would never be granted to him. He moved through the threshold spaces, the mists that separate worlds, the edges of twilight that belong to neither day nor night, the boundaries where the seen and unseen realms blur into one another, with no clear purpose or destination, driven only by an instinctive refusal to accept his condition, by a persistent hope that somehow, somewhere, a resolution might yet be found. It was in this state of absolute despair that Jack encountered the devil once more, though this encounter would prove far different from their previous meetings. The devil did not appear to Jack in anger or rage, though such emotions certainly burned within him. Rather, he appeared with a cold satisfaction, a sense of grim amusement at the fate that had befallen this mortal creature who had dared to humiliate him repeatedly. The devil came bearing a gift, or rather, what appeared on its surface to be a gift, though it was in truth an instrument of mockery and eternal punishment disguised in the form of charity. He held in his hands a turnip, hollowed and empty, its interior carved away to leave only a thin shell of vegetable matter. This turnip was not merely any simple gourd. It was a creation of demonic craftsmanship, designed specifically to serve as a vessel and a symbol of Jack's eternal fate. The devil explained to Jack, with a voice that seemed to contain within it the echoes of countless ages, the nature of his gift and the conditions of Jack's existence going forward. Jack would not be permitted rest. He would not be permitted cessation of consciousness. He would be forced to wander eternally between the worlds, neither arriving at destination nor achieving any sense of completion or purpose. The turnip, hollowed and empty, like Jack's own cursed existence, would serve as his lantern and his companion throughout all the ages to come, Within it, the devil placed a single ember, a coal of fire drawn from the very depths of hell itself, burning with an eternal flame that could never be extinguished and could never provide true warmth or comfort. This ember was no ordinary fire. It was a piece of hellfire itself, a fragment of the infernal flames that burn at the heart of perdition, extracted by the devil and imprisoned within the hollowed turnip, where it would burn forever without consuming its vessel, without providing light sufficient to truly dispel darkness, without offering any genuine solace to the tormented consciousness that carried it. The devil's mockery was profound and multi-layered, for the gift operated simultaneously as multiple forms of torment. The turnip itself, being a common vegetable associated with the Irish countryside and common folk, represented Jack's reduction from a being of significance to something utterly ordinary and contemptible. The hollowing of the turnip symbolized the hollowing of Jack's own existence, the emptying of meaning and purpose from his eternal wandering. The ember from hell was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all, for it represented the devil's ultimate refusal to allow Jack any genuine escape from infernal torment. Though Jack was technically not in hell, though he had successfully negotiated his escape from the underworld realms, he carried with him a piece of hell itself, a burning coal that would forever mark him as damned, as infernal, as belonging to the devil even in his exile and rejection. Yet the ember served another purpose as well, one that would prove far more significant in the long unfolding of centuries to come. The light from the burning coal, while insufficient to provide genuine illumination in the darkness that Jack inhabited, was nevertheless visible to other souls, particularly to those spirits and consciousnesses that found themselves lost in the liminal spaces between worlds. For Jack, condemned to wander eternally, the ember became simultaneously his curse and his strange form of purpose. He was transformed into a wanderer with a light, a consciousness that moved through the threshold spaces carrying illumination, albeit an eerie and unsettling illumination that spoke of damnation rather than salvation. Other lost souls, spirits trapped between worlds or temporarily displaced from either the living realm or the realm of the dead, saw Jack's glowing turnip and interpreted the light as a beacon, as a guide that might lead them toward resolution or escape from their own liminal condition. Some followed the light, hoping to find deliverance. Others followed it seeking merely the company of another consciousness in the profound isolation of the threshold spaces. Jack, despite his own damnation and despair, became in effect a guide to the lost, a carrier of light through darkness, a presence that marked the boundary between worlds. The devil's gift, then, was simultaneously a punishment and an ironic perversion of something approaching redemption. Jack had not earned grace or salvation through his trials. Indeed, his repeated defiance and manipulation had only secured for him a more complete and more terrible form of damnation. Yet, in the very nature of his punishment lay the seeds of a different kind of significance. Jack had become a marker of the liminal spaces, a symbol of the boundary between the living and the dead, a phenomenon that other souls encountered as they found themselves caught between worlds. The hollowed turnip, with its burning coal, became the physical manifestation of Jack's curse, the visible symbol of his eternal exile and wandering. It was this image, a carved turnip containing a glowing ember, carried by a restless spirit through the mist-shrouded countryside, that would eventually give rise to the folklore traditions and the legends that persisted across generations, that would be told and retold around Irish hearths during the darkening months of autumn. The turnip itself, being a vegetable of the Irish soil, a crop that had grown in Irish fields for generations, carried within it an association with the land itself, with the particular spiritual geography of Ireland, where the boundaries between worlds had always been known to grow permeable and thin. As Jack began his eternal wandering, carrying his hollowed turnip with its burning coal, people in the Irish countryside began to encounter him, or rather, they encountered the phenomenon associated with him. They saw strange lights moving through the fields at night, will-o'-the-wisps dancing at the edges of vision, a glow that seemed to come from no ordinary source, and that appeared to move with intention and purpose. Those who encountered these lights interpreted them through the lens of their existing folklore and understanding, and gradually the legend of Jack o' the Lantern began to form, the story of a cursed soul, condemned to wander eternally carrying a hellish light, neither fully alive nor genuinely dead, forever caught in the threshold between worlds. Across the Irish countryside, in villages and farmsteads scattered throughout the rural landscape, a phenomenon began to be reported with increasing frequency and consistency as the centuries passed following Jack's damnation. Travellers who ventured along isolated paths at night spoke of encountering strange lights, peculiar glows that seemed to emerge from the mist-shrouded fields and marshlands, lights that appeared to move with intention and consciousness, lights that defied natural explanation through fire or bioluminescence or any ordinary source of illumination. These phenomena, which would later become known throughout Irish folklore and eventually across the entire Celtic world, were attributed to Jack o'-the-Lantern himself, to the restless spirit cursed to wander eternally with his hollowed turnip and its burning coal. The lights appeared most frequently during the darkest months of the year, when the veil between the living and the dead grew thin, when the boundary between autumn and winter marked the liminal threshold that was most permeable to supernatural incursion. Farmers and travellers spoke of these lights with a mixture of fascination and dread, recognizing in them something that transcended ordinary natural phenomena, something that suggested the presence of forces and intelligences that existed beyond the comfortable boundaries of material reality. The manifestation that people encountered came to be known as will-o'-the-wisps, ethereal lights that seemed to float above bogs and marshlands, dancing with an almost playful quality that belied the genuine danger that they represented. To modern sensibilities, will-o'-the-wisps are sometimes explained through scientific rationalization, attributed to the ignition of phosphine gases that arise from decaying organic matter in marshy environments, or to other natural phenomena that produce bioluminescent effects. Yet to the Irish people who encountered these lights in the darkness of centuries past, such rational explanations held no currency and no relevance. They understood these lights as manifestations of supernatural presence, as evidence that the boundary between the material world and the realm of spirits was far more permeable than comfortable civilization might prefer to acknowledge. The lights would appear on roads and paths, seeming to beckon travelers forward, seeming to offer guidance or companionship in the darkness. Yet those foolish enough to follow these lights found themselves led astray, guided away from established paths, and into bogs and marshes, where they might become hopelessly lost or encounter genuine danger. The lights would dance before them, always just beyond reach, always seeming to promise that following just a bit further would bring clarity or resolution, when in fact each step brought only deeper confusion and more profound disorientation. People who experienced these encounters with the will-o'-the-wisps reported remarkably consistent phenomena across different regions and time periods, suggesting that they were encountering something genuinely real and not merely the product of individual imagination or local superstition. The lights were described as possessing a particular quality of luminescence, not warm and welcoming like firelight or lamplight, but rather cold and eerie, a glow that seemed somehow wrong, somehow emanating from a source that did not belong in the natural world. Witnesses spoke of the lights moving with apparent intelligence, changing directions suddenly, responding to the movements and actions of those who observed them, as if the phenomenon was not merely a passive visual effect, but rather an active consciousness deliberately interacting with human observers. The lights appeared most frequently in places of liminal significance, bogs and marshlands that represented boundaries between solid earth and water, places where the ground itself was unstable and unreliable, landscapes that embodied in their very geography the notion of threshold and transition. Those who followed the lights found themselves drawn deeper into these liminal spaces, increasingly separated from the familiar and settled world of human habitation and community, drawn into territories where the ordinary rules and protections of civilization no longer held sway. The realization gradually emerged among Irish communities that these phenomena were not random or meaningless, but rather manifestations of Jack himself, the cursed spirit condemned to wander eternally with his burning coal in its hollowed turnip. The lights were understood as Jack's presence made visible, the glow of his infernal coal penetrating the veil between worlds and becoming perceptible to human eyes. Yet more significantly, the lights came to be understood not merely as a phenomenon to be observed, but as a form of communication, as Jack's way of reaching across the boundary between the living and the dead to guide lost souls and spirits through the threshold spaces. Those who found themselves lost in the dark countryside, those who felt themselves caught between worlds or displaced from ordinary reality, might see Jack's light and interpret it as salvation, as evidence that a path forward existed, that they were not entirely abandoned in their desperation and isolation. In this way, Jack's curse transformed into a kind of inverted grace. The damned spirit became an inadvertent guide, a carrier of light in darkness, a presence that marked the boundary between worlds even as his own existence embodied punishment and exile. The phenomenon of will-o'-the-wisps thus became, in Irish folklore, a direct manifestation of Jack's presence and his eternal wandering. The interpretation of these lights evolved over time, shaped by the theological and spiritual frameworks that the Irish people employed to make sense of their world. With the gradual Christianization of Ireland, the pagan understanding of liminal spirits and threshold beings was incorporated into Christian cosmology and theology. Jack came to be understood not merely as a cursed wanderer, but as a warning, a manifestation of the consequences of defying divine and infernal order alike. Evidence that those who lived lives of selfishness and deception would face eternal consequences, regardless of how cleverly they attempted to manipulate their fate. The lights thus served a moral and pedagogical function within communities, becoming teaching tools that reinforce the importance of generosity, of humility before forces greater than oneself, of the recognition that human cunning could not ultimately transcend the cosmic order. Mothers warned their children against following strange lights in the darkness, using the legend of Jack o' the-Lantern to discourage them from wandering away from the safety and community of their homes. The phenomenon became a way of enforcing social boundaries, of marking certain territories and certain times as dangerous, as belonging to Jack and the spirits, and as consequently off-limits to ordinary human habitation and activity. Knowledge is power, and the Irish people possess knowledge hard-won through centuries of interaction with the supernatural realm. They understood through direct experience that the boundary between the visible and invisible worlds was not merely a line to be crossed, but a space that could be negotiated, manipulated, and defended. As the legend of Jack o'-the-Lantern spread and became embedded within the collective consciousness of Irish communities, people began to develop defensive strategies, ritual practices designed to protect themselves and their homes from the malevolent presence that Jack represented. These protective practices were not random or haphazardly conceived. Rather, They emerged from a profound understanding of how supernatural beings operate, what attracts them to human spaces, and what drives them away. The fundamental principle underlying these rituals was deceptively simple. One could ward off evil through the deliberate creation and display of images specifically designed to repel or confuse entities from the spirit world. Out of this principle emerged one of the most significant and enduring protective practices in Irish folklore: the carving of grotesque faces into hollowed turnips, a ritual that would eventually transform into one of the most iconic symbols of modern Halloween. The logic of this protective ritual operated according to principles that transcended simple superstition and reflected instead a sophisticated understanding of sympathetic magic and apotropeic practice. Apotropeic, a term derived from ancient Greek, refers to practices designed to ward off or avert evil, to turn aside malevolent influences through deliberate action and symbolic expression. The Irish people recognized that Jack himself, as a cursed spirit, embodied a fundamental principle of transgression and ugliness. His existence was a violation of natural order, a corruption of what should be, an embodiment of everything wrong with a soul that had rejected grace and chosen damnation. If one could create an image that embodied similar principles of ugliness and transgression, that captured in visible form the essence of supernatural corruption, then one might confuse or repel Jack and other malevolent spirits who encountered such imagery. The grotesque faces carved into turnips represented this principle made manifest. Deliberately ugly, deliberately transgressive, deliberately designed to embody distortion and violation of natural form. By placing these carved turnips at the boundaries of homes and properties, families created a protective barrier of sorts. A boundary marked by images so deliberately and aggressively ugly that supernatural entities might be repelled or confused rather than attracted. The carving of these faces required deliberate intentionality and a specific ritual mindset. This was not a task undertaken casually or without significance. Rather, families approached the creation of these protective turnips with the understanding that they were engaging in a form of magical practice, a deliberate intervention in the realm of supernatural forces. The faces carved into the turnips were typically rendered as grotesque and exaggerated, with enlarged features, distorted expressions, and deliberate ugliness that transcended natural human physiognomy. Some were carved with expressions of rage or malevolence, as if the turnip itself had been transformed into a guardian creature, a protective entity that would stand watch over the property and the family inhabiting it. Others displayed expressions of mockery or contempt, as if the turnips themselves were commenting on and rejecting the supernatural forces that might threaten the household. The carving itself was sometimes accompanied by ritual speech or prayer, words spoken with intention and force, declarations of protection and rejection directed toward the spirit world. Some families carved protective symbols into the turnips alongside the grotesque faces, crosses, or other religious symbols that carried Christian significance and were believed to carry power against supernatural malevolence. The entire practice embodied a recognition that the physical world and the spiritual world were engaged in constant negotiation and interaction, that one could influence spiritual forces through deliberate action and symbolic expression in the material realm. As darkness fell and night descended upon Irish villages, these carved turnips would be illuminated from within, their interiors hollowed out and filled with candles or other light sources that would make the grotesque faces glow from within, creating eerie shadows and distorted illumination that transformed the ordinary vegetables into something genuinely unsettling and otherworldly. The light emanating from within the carved turnips created an effect of particular significance. It suggested animation, as if the faces had become alive, as if the protective intent behind the carving had been activated and given visible expression through illumination. Families would place these glowing turnips at entryways, along pathways leading to their homes, and at boundary points where the domestic space met the wild and untamed countryside. The message communicated by these illuminated guardians was unmistakable. This space is protected. This boundary is marked. Malevolent spirits are not welcome within this threshold. The practice represented a form of aggressive hospitality toward the supernatural realm. The Irish people were essentially saying to Jack and other dangerous entities, "We acknowledge your existence, we respect your power, but you are not welcome here. Our boundary is marked, our protection is visible, proceed elsewhere." The effectiveness of these protective practices, from the perspective of the communities that engaged in them, was demonstrated through the simple fact that families who maintained these rituals did not experience the catastrophic supernatural visitations that threatened those without such protections. While this correlation was likely more psychological than genuinely magical, the belief in protection itself providing comfort and reducing anxiety and risky behavior, the Irish people interpreted the success of their protective practices as evidence of their genuine power. Mothers taught their children about the significance of the carved turnips, explaining the stories of Jack and other malevolent spirits, and instructing them on the importance of maintaining these protective rituals as autumn turned to winter. The carved turnips became visual reminders of the supernatural threats that existed in the world, evidence that one could actively resist and repel such threats through intentional action and symbolic practice. They represented a form of human agency in the face of cosmic forces that seemed far more powerful and far less subject to human control or understanding. The ritual itself, regardless of its objective efficacy in repelling supernatural entities, provided psychological and spiritual comfort to the families who maintained it. A sense that they had taken action, that they possessed tools and knowledge that allowed them to protect themselves and their loved ones from forces that would otherwise have seemed utterly beyond their capacity to influence or resist. History moves in waves, in great tides of human migration driven by necessity, desperation, and the pursuit of opportunity that calls to those willing to leave behind everything familiar. In the 19th century, beginning in the 1840s and continuing through the 1850s and beyond, Ireland experienced one of the most devastating catastrophes of its history, the Great Famine, a period of starvation and disease that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Irish civilization and scatter its people across the continents of the world. Millions of Irish families faced a choice that no human should ever have to make: remain in a homeland that could no longer sustain them, a place where the potato crops upon which they depended had failed catastrophically, leaving behind nothing but death and suffering, or venture across the Atlantic Ocean to distant shores where the possibility, however uncertain, of survival and prosperity seemed to beckon. Countless families chose emigration, boarding ships in Irish ports with whatever meager possessions they could carry, leaving behind generations of history and cultural continuity in the desperate hope that somewhere across the vast ocean they might find conditions less hostile to their continued existence. The Irish who emigrated during this period were refugees in all but name, fleeing a catastrophe of unprecedented scale, carrying with them the trauma of loss and the desperate determination to build new lives in lands utterly foreign and unknown to them. Among these millions of Irish emigrants were families who possessed not only the material possessions that could be carried aboard a ship, but also the immaterial inheritance of cultural knowledge, folklore, and tradition that defined their identity as Irish people. They carried with them stories, tales of their homeland, legends of the supernatural beings that inhabited Irish landscapes, knowledge of protective rituals and ancient practices that had sustained their communities through centuries of danger and uncertainty. These Irish families, settling in cities and countryside across North America brought with them the complete cultural apparatus of their identity, including the traditions and folklore that had emerged from their interaction with the supernatural realm of their homeland. Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival that marked the boundary between summer and winter, between the year that was ending and the year about to begin, remained a significant date in their cultural calendar. The stories of Jack-o'-the-lantern, of the will-o'-the-wisps that danced across Irish bogs, of the necessity of protective rituals to guard against malevolent spirits during the dangerous twilight season. These narratives persisted, were told and retold, maintained their significance within immigrant communities, even as the physical landscape around them transformed entirely. Yet the Irish emigrants who crossed the Atlantic did not arrive in territories that were culturally or environmentally identical to the homeland they had left behind. America was a vast and strange land, with geography and climate utterly different from Ireland, with landscapes that bore no resemblance to the mist-shrouded countryside, the ancient stone circles, or the liminal bogs that Irish folklore had been shaped around. The crops that grew in American soil were different from those that had sustained Irish agriculture for centuries. The potato, which had become the primary sustenance crop in Ireland by the time of the famine, was certainly available in America, but alongside it grew other crops unfamiliar to most Irish farmers. Most significantly, the pumpkin, a large and abundant gourd that grew prolifically in North American soil, and bore no resemblance to the turnips that had been the vehicle for Irish protective rituals. As Irish families established themselves in their new homeland, as they sought to maintain their cultural traditions and their spiritual practices in this foreign environment, they encountered a practical problem. The turnips that had served as the basis for their protective rituals were neither abundant nor as easily cultivated in America as they had been in Ireland. The soil and climate of the New World were not suited to the turnip in quite the same way that Irish soil had been. What emerged from this cultural and environmental collision was not the abandonment of tradition, but rather its adaptation, a transformation driven by practical necessity, yet operating according to the same principles and logic that had guided the original practice. The pumpkin, being abundant and readily available, being large and easy to hollow out, being native to the American landscape in a way that the turnip was not, became the natural substitute for the traditional Irish turnip. Irish families, maintaining their protective rituals in their new homeland, began to carve grotesque faces into pumpkins rather than turnips, hollowing them out and illuminating them from within with candles, placing them at boundaries and entryways, much as their ancestors had done with turnips in Ireland. This was not a corruption or diminishment of the original practice, but rather a natural and organic evolution, a demonstration of how cultural traditions could adapt and persist even when the specific material conditions and physical environment changed dramatically. The pumpkin was, in many ways, superior to the turnip as a vehicle for this ritual. It was larger, more durable, easier to carve with greater detail, and capable of producing more dramatic effects when illuminated from within. The abundance of pumpkins in America meant that families need not ration their protective practices or limit themselves to a single carved gourd, but could create multiple protective sentinels to guard their properties and their families. The substitution of pumpkins for turnips represented something far more significant than a mere material exchange. It represented the grafting of Irish cultural practice onto American soil, the transplantation of ancient tradition into a new landscape where it would take root and flourish in ways that neither Irish nor American peoples could have fully anticipated. The pumpkin became, in the hands of Irish Americans, not merely a crop or a seasonal decoration, but a vehicle for cultural identity and spiritual practice, a tangible connection to a homeland that many of these families would never see again. Second-generation Irish Americans, born in the New World, grew up seeing pumpkins carved with protective faces illuminated during the autumn season. And while they might not have possessed the same lived experience of Irish landscapes and Irish supernatural folklore as their parents or grandparents, they inherited the practice itself, the knowledge that certain seasons and certain rituals mattered, that there existed boundaries between the seen and unseen worlds that deserved respect and active acknowledgement. The pumpkin, therefore, became not merely a symbol of harvest or of autumn celebration, but rather a living link to Irish heritage, a tradition transported across an ocean and adapted to new circumstances, yet maintaining its essential spiritual significance. The transformation from turnip to pumpkin was not a sudden substitution that occurred in a single moment or through any deliberate decision made by community leaders or cultural authorities. Rather, it was an organic and gradual evolution that unfolded across decades, driven by practical considerations and environmental realities, yet carrying within it profound implications for how Jack's legend would persist and transform in the New World. Irish families scattered across North America found themselves in vastly different climates and agricultural conditions than those of their homeland, and the simple act of maintaining traditional practices required adaptation and flexibility. The turnip, while a hardy crop, was not cultivated as extensively in 19th century America as it had been in Ireland, and for families already struggling with the trauma of displacement and the economic precarity of immigration, the decision to carve protective faces into whatever gourds were most readily available and abundant made immediate and practical sense. The pumpkin was ubiquitous in American agriculture, growing in abundance across the continent, harvested in the same autumn season, when protective rituals held the greatest significance, and proving to be a far more workable medium for the carving and illumination that the ritual demanded. The pumpkin itself carries within its history an interesting paradox that deserves examination. Indigenous to the Americas for thousands of years, cultivated by native peoples long before European contact, the pumpkin had become deeply embedded in North American agricultural and cultural traditions by the time Irish immigrants arrived seeking refuge from famine and desperation. The crop that would become the primary vehicle for preserving Irish protective rituals was therefore indigenous to the land these Irish emigrants were entering, was part of the natural and cultural landscape of America in ways that reflected centuries of native cultivation and integration. When Irish Americans substituted pumpkins for turnips, they were not merely making a practical accommodation to their new environment. They were, perhaps unconsciously, engaging in a form of cultural synthesis, taking elements from the indigenous landscape and incorporating them into their own inherited traditions. This represented a subtle but significant moment of cultural transformation, a point at which Irish traditions began to become American traditions, where Old World practices were grafted onto New World materials in ways that would eventually produce something genuinely hybrid, neither purely Irish nor purely American, but rather a synthesis of both. The pumpkin, being considerably larger than the typical turnip, allowed for far more elaborate and detailed carving than had been possible with the smaller and harder root vegetables that Irish families had worked with for centuries. Carvers began to create faces of greater complexity and expressive power, rendering features with greater clarity and specificity, producing protective guardians of considerable artistic sophistication. The larger surface area of the pumpkin permitted the creation of multiple facial features with greater separation and definition, allowing carvers to express a wider range of emotional content and protective intention through their work. Some carved faces became increasingly elaborate, with complex expressions suggesting not merely protection, but also judgment, warning, and supernatural authority. The hollow interior of the pumpkin, being more spacious than that of a turnip, allowed for the placement of larger and brighter light sources, not merely candles, but eventually, in the modern era, electric lights, that could produce more dramatic and more visible effects when the sun set and darkness descended. The pumpkin thus represented not merely a functional substitute for the turnip, but an actual improvement in terms of the ritual's potential for expression and effectiveness. The abundance of pumpkins in America also permitted a democratization of the protective ritual in ways that had not been possible in Ireland. In a land of scarcity like famine-stricken Ireland, each carved turnip represented a commitment of limited resources, and families might maintain only one or two protective guardians positioned at their most vulnerable boundaries. In America, where pumpkins grew abundantly and were considered a crop of relatively limited economic value compared to other agricultural products, families could carve multiple pumpkins and position them throughout their properties, creating networks of protective sentinels rather than isolated guardians. This multiplication of protective imagery meant that the ritual itself became more visible, more widespread, and more integrated into the fabric of community life. Neighborhoods filled with Irish American families would display multiple illuminated pumpkins throughout the autumn season, creating landscapes transformed by deliberately ugly and protective imagery. Places where the supernatural realm was explicitly acknowledged and actively resisted through collective action and shared cultural practice. The ritual that had been maintained in relative isolation in Irish countryside became, in American urban and suburban settings, a visible and communal practice that marked entire neighborhoods as places where traditional beliefs and practices held significant meaning. As the decades progressed and generations of Irish Americans were born and raised in the New World, the specific Irish context and origin of the pumpkin carving ritual began to fade from collective memory in some communities, replaced by a more generalized American understanding of the practice as a seasonal decoration and autumn tradition. Other communities, however, maintained explicit awareness of the ritual's Irish origins and continued to transmit the stories and legends associated with Jack-o'-the-lantern to new generations. The pumpkin became increasingly associated with American culture, with Halloween celebrations, with harvest themes and autumn imagery that had little direct connection to the specific Irish, supernatural folklore that had originally generated the practice. Yet beneath this American veneer, the fundamental logic and purpose of the ritual remained unchanged. The creation and display of deliberately grotesque and protective imagery designed to acknowledge and ward off supernatural danger during the liminal season when the boundary between the living and the dead grew permeable. The transformation of the turnip into the pumpkin represented, therefore, not a loss of meaning or power, but rather a translation of that meaning and power into a new context, a demonstration of how traditions could maintain their essential character, even as their material form and cultural context underwent profound transformation. What is particularly significant about this evolution is how completely the pumpkin came to eclipse the turnip in American consciousness and practice. By the late 19th century, and certainly by the 20th century, most Americans associated jack-o'-lanterns specifically with pumpkins, with carved pumpkins as the standard and expected form of the tradition. The turnip, the original vehicle for Jack's legend in Ireland, faded into obscurity for most Americans, became something relegated to historical footnotes and folklore studies rather than active practice. Irish Americans themselves, after a generation or two in their new homeland, often forgot or diminished the significance of the turnip's role in their ancestral traditions, accepting the pumpkin as the natural and expected medium for their rituals and celebrations. Yet this erasure of the turnip from popular consciousness was neither complete nor irreversible. In recent decades, as interest in preserving ancestral traditions and reclaiming cultural heritage has grown, some Irish Americans and others interested in maintaining authentic connection to traditional practices have deliberately returned to the use of turnips in their jack-o'-lantern carvings, seeking to recreate the exact practices of their ancestors and to maintain material continuity with the traditions of pre-immigration Ireland. To understand the true significance of Jack's curse and the hollowed pumpkin that became his eternal companion, one must step beyond the simple narrative of punishment and damnation and consider instead the deeper and more complex role that Jack's light plays in the cosmic order. The fire that burns within the carved pumpkin is indeed hellish in its origin, a coal drawn from perdition itself, yet the light that emanates from it serves purposes that transcend mere torment or warning. Jack, condemned to wander between worlds, became through his damnation an inadvertent beacon, a source of illumination in the darkness of the threshold spaces, a light that calls to those who find themselves lost between the realms of the living and the dead. This light, emanating from a source that belongs neither fully to the underworld nor to the world above, possesses a unique quality. It cannot mislead those who approach it with genuine need and genuine seeking, for it originates from a place that understands profoundly the condition of being lost and abandoned. Jack's light thus became a guide for lost souls, a phenomenon of profound spiritual significance that transcended the original intention of his damnation and transformed punishment into an inverted form of salvation. Consider the metaphysical implications of this transformation. A soul that has been rejected by both heaven and hell, a consciousness excluded from all established orders and hierarchies, might seem to possess nothing of value to offer to other beings. Yet Jack's very condition of absolute exile created within him an understanding of the experience of being lost that few other entities could match. He knew the despair of rejection, the terror of exclusion, the desperate isolation of being unwelcome everywhere. When other souls found themselves caught between worlds, spirits unable to complete their transitions, consciousnesses displaced from their proper destinations, entities trapped in the liminal spaces through accident or misfortune, they encountered in Jack a being who truly understood their condition, who moved through the same threshold spaces they inhabited, who carried with him a light that suggested navigation was possible even in seemingly impossible circumstances. The light itself became a language of sorts, a form of communication that transcended words, expressing through its gentle but persistent glow the message that one was not entirely alone in the darkness, that a path forward existed even when all other bearings seemed lost. The nature of Jack's guiding light differs profoundly from other forms of illumination one might encounter in the supernatural realm or in ordinary existence. Whereas ordinary light seeks to reveal and clarify, to make visible what was previously hidden in darkness, Jack's light accepts the darkness and exists alongside it rather than attempting to dispel it entirely. It does not claim to show the full truth or to provide complete understanding. Rather, it simply marks a presence, a continuity, a consciousness that persists in the threshold spaces and acknowledges through its burning the persistence of other consciousnesses similarly trapped or lost. For souls who have found themselves displaced and confused, the appearance of Jack's light communicates something crucial. The threshold spaces, while dangerous and disorienting, are not entirely empty or entirely abandoned. There exists within them entities with knowledge of navigation, consciousness with experience of survival in liminality, presence that suggests that one might endure and eventually find resolution. The light thus serves a primarily psychological and spiritual function. It provides comfort, orientation, and hope to those who encounter it, transforming despair into cautious possibility and absolute isolation into something approaching companionship. Across the centuries of Jack's wandering, countless lost souls have encountered his light and been guided through the threshold spaces by its gentle but persistent illumination. Some of these encounters are recorded in folklore traditions and oral histories, preserved as stories told by travelers and witnesses who experienced or reported supernatural phenomena that seemed to defy ordinary explanation. A traveler lost in an impenetrable fog reports seeing a light that guided them safely back to settled lands. A light that appeared and disappeared according to no rational pattern. A phenomenon that left them with the certain knowledge that some form of intelligence and compassion had intervened to save them from being lost indefinitely in the mist. A person hovering at the threshold of death reports, seeing Jack's light and feeling drawn toward it, experiencing through that light a communication that eased their transition into whatever state awaited them beyond mortal existence. A child who had wandered too far from their family in the darkness speaks of a strange glow that seemed to lead them back toward the sounds of home and safety, a phenomenon that their family interpreted as miraculous intervention by protective spirits. These stories, told and retold across generations, accumulated into a folk tradition that recognized Jack's light as fundamentally ambiguous, dangerous if followed by the unprepared or the foolish, yet genuinely beneficial when encountered by those truly in need of guidance and assistance. The duality of Jack's light, its capacity to both lead astray and to genuinely guide, reflects the fundamental ambiguity of the liminal spaces themselves. The threshold between worlds is inherently neither good nor evil, neither beneficial nor harmful. Rather, it is a space of transformation and transition, where outcomes depend upon the preparedness and intention of those who navigate it. Jack's light, like the threshold spaces themselves, is morally neutral in an absolute sense, though it can be experienced as either blessing or curse depending upon the circumstances of the encounter and the nature of the consciousness perceiving it. A soul approaching with genuine need and genuine openness to transformation will find in Jack's light a guide toward resolution and peace. A consciousness animated by greed, selfishness, or refusal to accept necessary change will find Jack's light leading them deeper into confusion and disorientation, into territories where they become increasingly lost and increasingly desperate. The light does not judge its observers, rather, it reflects their nature, responding to their essential character and their true intentions. In this way, Jack's damnation became his redemption, his curse became his purpose, his exile became the source of his significance. The soul rejected by all cosmic orders became paradoxically the most important guide within the spaces where cosmic orders dissolve and lose their meaning. Understanding Jack's light in this way permits us to see his entire narrative differently, not merely as a story of punishment and consequence, but as a story of transformation and redemptive irony. The devil's mockery in providing Jack with the hollowed turnip and the burning coal became, through the operation of cosmic principles that transcend even infernal authority, a tool of genuine assistance and spiritual guidance. Jack was punished for his arrogance and his defiance, yet that punishment itself became the mechanism through which his arrogance and defiance were transformed into something capable of serving others. He cannot achieve peace or rest, yet his inability to rest means that his light persists eternally in the threshold spaces, available always to those who need it. He cannot be welcomed into heaven or into hell, yet his exclusion from all established orders made him uniquely capable of understanding and assisting those similarly displaced and excluded. The universe operates according to a logic far more complex and far more nuanced than simple justice or simple punishment. sometimes the cruelest punishment becomes the means through which the deepest service is rendered. To fully comprehend the significance of Jack-o'-the-lantern and the carved pumpkin that has become his eternal symbol, one must journey backward through time to the ancient Celtic world, to a festival and a worldview that predated Christianity by centuries, that embodied a relationship with the supernatural realm fundamentally different from the theological frameworks that would later come to dominate European spirituality. The ancient Celtic peoples, whose civilization flourished across Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and much of continental Europe before the Roman conquests and the eventual Christianization of their territories, possessed a sophisticated understanding of time that differed profoundly from the linear, progressive conception of history that characterizes modern Western thought. For the Celts, time was cyclical, operating according to patterns of death and rebirth, of seasons that turned perpetually into one another, of boundaries between different states of being that were permeable and meaningful rather than fixed and absolute. The year itself was divided not into the familiar structure of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, but rather into two great halves. The light half representing growth, activity, and the dominion of summer, and the dark half representing dormancy, withdrawal, and the dominion of winter. The boundary between these two halves was marked by a festival of profound spiritual and practical significance. Samhain, celebrated at what we now know as the end of October, the moment when the old year died and the new year was born. Samhain was far more than a simple seasonal celebration or a marking of agricultural transition, though it certainly encompassed those dimensions. Rather, it was understood as a moment of genuine danger and genuine opportunity, a time when the boundary between the material world and the realm of spirits and the dead grew so thin that beings from the unseen world could cross into the visible world with relative ease, and conversely, human beings might find themselves drawn across the threshold into territories not meant for living consciousness. The barriers that normally separated the realm of the living from the realm of the dead, from the territories inhabited by the Sidhe and other supernatural beings, essentially dissolved during Samhain, leaving the human world vulnerable to incursion and invasion by forces from beyond. Yet this vulnerability was not entirely negative or undesired. Rather, it represented an opportunity for negotiation and communication with the supernatural realm, a time when one might approach the Sidhe with requests or offerings, when one might seek knowledge or assistance from entities not normally accessible to human consciousness. The festival involved elaborate rituals and practices designed to manage this dangerous threshold period. Bonfires were lit at high places to guide and control the movements of spirits. Food and drink were left as offerings to appease potentially dangerous entities, and families gathered together for protection and communal reinforcement against the incursions of the otherworld. When Christianity spread throughout the Celtic territories, converting populations and gradually replacing pagan religious practices with Christian theology and ritual, a fascinating and complex process of cultural synthesis occurred. Rather than attempting to completely eradicate the Samhain festival and its associated practices, Christian authorities in many cases incorporated the Celtic celebration into the Christian calendar and theological framework, transforming its significance while preserving its essential structure and timing. The period around Samhain became associated with the Christian commemoration of the dead, particularly through the festivals of All Hallows' Eve, All Saints' Day, and All Souls' Day, which fall on October 31st, November 1st, and November 2nd, respectively. These Christian observances, while possessing their own theological rationale and spiritual significance, became superimposed upon the ancient Celtic festival, creating a syncretic blend of pagan and Christian elements that acknowledged both traditions while fully belonging to neither. The ancient understanding of Samhain as a time when the boundary between worlds grew thin, was thus preserved within Christian culture, expressed now through the lens of Christian theology rather than Celtic paganism, yet maintaining much of its essential character and much of its practical significance within communities' lived experience of the sacred calendar. It was within this syncretic context, this space where Celtic and Christian traditions coexisted and interpenetrated one another, that the legend of Jack-o'-the-lantern found its most natural home and its most powerful expression. Jack's story, emerging from Irish folklore in the medieval period, carried within it both pagan and Christian elements, both the pre-Christian understanding of the supernatural realm and the Christian theology of sin, punishment, and divine judgment. Jack himself embodied the conflict between these two worldviews. His deceptions and his defiance reflected a kind of pre-Christian arrogance and refusal to acknowledge cosmic order. Yet his punishment and his eternal wandering reflected Christian understanding of consequences and damnation. The hollowed turnip with its burning coal emerging from the Irish countryside and carried across the Atlantic to the New World became a symbol that encompassed all these layers of meaning and tradition. It represented simultaneously the Celtic understanding of the boundary between worlds as a permeable and dangerous threshold, the Christian theology of hell and infernal punishment, and the human capacity to create protective magical symbols designed to ward off supernatural danger. The carved pumpkin, therefore, when placed in yards and on porches during the October season, became a visible marker of this syncretic tradition, a symbol that acknowledged multiple spiritual frameworks and multiple understandings of the relationship between the human world and the realm of spirits and the dead. As centuries passed and as the Samhain and Halloween traditions continued to evolve, the specific Irish origins and the specific Irish legends associated with Jack began to spread beyond Irish communities and Irish American communities into the broader culture of English-speaking nations and, eventually, into global popular culture. The carved pumpkin, which had emerged from Irish protective rituals designed to ward off Jack and other malevolent spirits, gradually became understood simply as a Halloween decoration, a seasonal symbol associated with autumn harvest and supernatural celebration, without necessarily carrying within it any awareness of Jack's specific legend or the apotropeic purposes that had originally generated the practice. Yet beneath this generalization of the symbol lay persistent threads of genuine tradition, continuities that connected modern Halloween celebrations to ancient Samhain observances, that linked carved pumpkins to medieval Irish protective rituals, that connected contemporary children in costume to the ancient understanding that the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin during the autumn season. The modern Halloween celebration, while often stripped of explicit supernatural significance and reduced to commercialized entertainment, nevertheless preserves within itself traces and echoes of these ancient and medieval traditions, maintaining within the structure of its observance a recognition, however attenuated, that certain times and certain places carry special significance, that the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary deserves acknowledgement and careful navigation. The modern world, with all its technological sophistication and its deliberate distancing from the supernatural beliefs that animated earlier centuries, has not forgotten Jack-o'-the-lantern. If anything, contemporary culture has embraced and reimagined the legend with remarkable creativity and energy, demonstrating that ancient folklore possesses a resilience and adaptability that allows it to persist even in cultural contexts seemingly hostile to belief in the supernatural. Jack appears now not only in traditional folklore preservation efforts and historical scholarship, but also in contemporary literature, in cinema and television, in popular music, in video games, and in the vast realm of internet culture and digital storytelling. The legend has been reimagined countless times, transformed and adapted to reflect contemporary concerns and contemporary aesthetic sensibilities. Yet its essential narrative structure, that of a clever human who defies authority and faces eternal consequences, remains remarkably consistent across these diverse retellings. Writers and creators working in the modern era have found in Jack's story a kind of archetypal power that speaks to enduring human concerns. The fear of defying legitimate authority, the temptation to believe that cleverness alone is sufficient to navigate life, the terror of eternal exile and rejection, the strange redemption that can emerge from the most complete forms of failure and damnation. Literature has been particularly fertile ground for reimagining Jack's legend, with contemporary authors treating the material with varying degrees of fidelity to traditional sources and varying degrees of creative liberty. Some works have attempted to recover and preserve the original Irish folklore as faithfully as possible, creating historical fiction or folkloric fiction that seeks to maintain authentic connection to the medieval and early modern sources from which Jack's legend emerged. Others have taken the basic narrative elements, the clever trickster, the supernatural adversary, the impossible escape and subsequent eternal punishment, and transplanted them into entirely different contexts, different time periods, different cultural settings, demonstrating the archetypal power of the story structure itself. Contemporary fantasy literature has treated Jack as a complex figure, worthy of sympathetic portrayal, despite his fundamental flaws and his ultimate damnation, exploring the psychological dimensions of his character, investigating the origins of his defiant nature, imagining his internal experience of his eternal curse. Graphic novels and comics have similarly embraced Jack's legend, creating visual interpretations that emphasize the grotesque and the supernatural, that explore the aesthetic dimensions of his perpetual wandering and his relationship with the hollowed pumpkin that marks his eternal presence. Cinema and television have proven even more transformative in their treatment of Jack's legend, with filmmakers adapting the material in directions ranging from the faithful to the radically innovative. Horror films have incorporated Jack-o'-lantern into various narratives, sometimes as an explicit character appearing in supernatural form, other times as an indirect influence, a presence that haunts narratives set around Halloween and autumn season. Some films have attempted to tell Jack's entire story, dramatizing his encounters with the devil and his subsequent damnation and eternal wandering, creating visual spectacles that render the supernatural elements of the legend in cinematically compelling ways. Other films have used Jack's legend as a kind of raw material, extracting certain elements while discarding others, combining Jack's narrative with other horror tropes and contemporary concerns to create hybrid stories that acknowledge their folkloric origins while creating something entirely new. Television series exploring supernatural themes, historical drama, or fantasy narratives have similarly drawn upon Jack's legend, incorporating elements of his story into episodes or season-long arcs that seek to engage audiences through both the power of ancient tradition and through contemporary production values and storytelling techniques. The consistent appearance of Jack across so many different media and in so many different forms demonstrates the deep cultural resonance that the legend continues to possess despite the centuries that have passed since Jack's medieval origin. Popular music has also participated in the reimagining of Jack's legend, with musicians across various genres creating songs that reference, elaborate upon, or reinterpret elements of Jack's story. Folk musicians and traditional musicians have created works that seek to preserve and celebrate the authentic folkloric sources, treating Jack's legend with the respect accorded to other significant elements of cultural heritage. Rock and metal musicians have drawn upon Jack's legend to create darker and more intense musical expressions, using the supernatural elements and the horror dimensions of the story as inspiration for aggressive and provocative artistic work. Hip-hop artists have occasionally referenced Jack in lyrics that play with the contradiction between the contemporary urban context and the ancient folkloric material, creating juxtapositions that highlight both continuity and transformation in how traditions persist across very different cultural contexts. The fact that musicians working in such radically different genres and addressing such different audiences have all found material worthy of adaptation in Jack's legend speaks to the fundamental power and adaptability of the narrative itself, suggesting that certain story structures and certain archetypal figures possess almost universal resonance that allows them to speak across the boundaries of genre, medium, and cultural context. Video games and interactive digital media represent perhaps the newest frontier for Jack's Legend's continuing evolution and reinterpretation. Game designers have incorporated Jack-o'-lantern into various narratives, sometimes as a direct character or enemy that players encounter, other times as an atmospheric presence that haunts particular game environments. The interactive nature of gaming creates unique possibilities for engagement with the legend, allowing players not merely to observe or consume Jack's story, but to actively participate in it, to make choices that influence how the narrative develops. Some games have incorporated elements of Jack's legend into larger horror or supernatural frameworks, creating experiences where Jack appears as part of a broader cosmology of supernatural beings and magical systems. Others have extracted the essential elements of Jack's curse and created original narratives that employ similar story structures. A clever character defying authority and facing eternal consequences. The relative novelty of digital gaming as a medium means that possibilities for creative reimagining of Jack's legend within interactive contexts remain largely unexplored, suggesting that future creators will continue to find new ways to engage with and transform this ancient material through emerging technologies and emerging forms of artistic expression. We have journeyed far across time and space, from the medieval Irish countryside where Jack first walked the earth as a living man, through the moment of his terrible damnation and eternal wandering, to the modern world where his legend continues to influence and inspire millions of people who may never have consciously encountered his story, yet participate unconsciously in traditions born from his fate. Now, as we approach the conclusion of this exploration, we must ask ourselves a fundamental question. Why does Jack endure? Why does a medieval Irish legend about a clever man who defied the devil and faced eternal punishment continue to resonate across centuries and continents, continuing to influence how entire cultures commemorate the boundary between autumn and winter, between the living and the dead, between the seen and unseen worlds? The answer to this question lies not in any particular element of Jack's story, but rather in the totality of its themes and the profound truths about human nature that the legend encapsulates. Jack-o'-the-Lantern persists because his story speaks to fundamental aspects of the human condition that remain unchanging across all eras and all cultures, that continue to matter regardless of technological advancement or social transformation. At its core, Jack's legend explores the relationship between human ambition and cosmic authority, between the desire for freedom and the reality of limitation, between the intelligence that permits us to devise clever solutions to our problems and the humility that recognizes the existence of forces and powers that transcend our capacity to control. Jack's story is fundamentally a tragedy, yet it is a tragedy of a particular kind, one that emerges not from circumstances beyond human control, but rather from human choice, from Jack's deliberate refusal to acknowledge authority or to accept the boundaries that cosmic order attempts to impose. In this refusal, Jack embodies a kind of human defiance that many people recognize within themselves, that resonates with the part of us that wants to believe that cleverness and determination alone are sufficient to overcome any obstacle, that we might transcend the limitations imposed upon us through wit and audacity. Yet Jack's fate demonstrates the terrible consequences of pursuing this belief too far, of allowing the confidence in our own intelligence to blind us to the existence of forces and intelligences far greater and far more ancient than our own. The legend thus functions as a cautionary tale, yet not in a simple or moralizing way. Rather, it presents a complex meditation on the costs and consequences of human ambition, exploring the question of whether defiance against cosmic order is admirable or foolish, courageous or arrogant. Jack's damnation, viewed from a certain perspective, might be understood as just. He lived a life of selfishness and cruelty. He deliberately manipulated and humiliated those around him, and he ultimately defied divine and infernal authority alike through his repeated tricks and deceptions. Yet Jack's damnation might also be understood as profoundly unjust. He is punished not merely for the sins he committed, but also for the cleverness through which he escaped temporal punishment. He is denied the mercy of true damnation because he refused to accept his prescribed fate. He is excluded from all cosmic orders because he dared to negotiate with them rather than submit to them completely. This moral ambiguity lies at the heart of Jack's legend's enduring power, for it prevents the story from being reduced to simple moral lessons and instead permits it to function as genuine tragedy, as a narrative that explores genuinely irresolvable tensions within the human condition and the cosmic order itself. Jack's story suggests that the universe operates according to principles far more complex and far more subtle than simple justice or simple punishment, that even the most terrible fates can become the source of unexpected meaning and unexpected service, that the boundaries between redemption and damnation, between blessing and curse, are far more permeable and far less absolute than conventional theology suggests. The carved pumpkin itself, the primary physical symbol through which Jack's legend persists in contemporary culture, represents this ambiguity and this complexity in a particularly elegant way. The pumpkin is a domestic object, a product of agricultural labor and human cultivation. Yet, it is deliberately transformed through carving into something grotesque and transgressive, something designed to repel or to frighten. It is an object of beauty and harvest abundance, yet it is deliberately disfigured and hollowed out in order to fulfill its protective purpose. The light that burns within the carved pumpkin is described in Jack's legend as hellish in origin, yet that same light serves to guide lost souls and to acknowledge the presence of consciousness in liminal spaces. The pumpkin thus becomes a perfect symbol for Jack's entire narrative, an object that contains within itself profound contradictions, that serves multiple and sometimes contradictory purposes simultaneously, that cannot be reduced to simple meanings or simple interpretations. When families place carved pumpkins at their doorways and windows during the autumn season, they are participating in a practice whose origins they may not consciously understand, yet which connects them to centuries of tradition, to ancient Samhain observances, to medieval Irish protective rituals, to the story of a damned soul whose curse became the foundation for one of the world's most recognizable symbols. What Jack's legend ultimately reveals about human nature is that we are creatures capable of profound contradiction, that we contain within ourselves the capacity for both wisdom and foolishness, for both generosity and selfishness, for both humility and arrogance. Jack himself embodied these contradictions. He was clever enough to outwit the devil repeatedly, yet not wise enough to recognize that such victories would ultimately prove hollow and self-defeating. He possessed the courage necessary to defy cosmic authority, yet he lacked the humility to accept the inevitable consequences of his defiance. His story permits us to recognize similar contradictions within ourselves, to acknowledge that the very qualities that enable us to survive and to flourish in ordinary circumstances might also blind us to larger truths and larger dangers. The legend thus functions not as a tool for simple moral instruction, but rather as a mirror that reflects back to us the complexity of human nature and the difficulty inherent in navigating existence according to principles both wise and courageous. We invite you to continue exploring these themes with us here at Echoes of the Old World, where we believe that understanding our cultural heritage and our connections to ancient traditions is essential to understanding ourselves. Subscribe to our channel to join a community dedicated to exploring the profound stories that shaped civilization, the legends that persist across centuries, and the truths about human nature that these ancient tales continue to reveal. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Jack's legend, for allowing us to share with you the story of how one damned soul's curse became the foundation for a tradition that touches millions of lives each year. May the light of the jack-o'-lantern continue to guide us through the darkening season and remind us always of the complex and paradoxical nature of existence itself.